Hi, welcome to Minutes with Mickey. A time for us to wonder about the story called Elijah and the Whirlwind, which we find in 2 Kings chapter 2. This is one of those stories that I remember growing up with as a child. We would always be shown some beautifully artistic drawing, some sort of like almost like a famous artwork that would show Elijah holding on to the reins of these horses that looked like they were just on fire and they would be heading towards heaven. So the trajectory of the painting was always going up, and you would see almost like the chariot was on fire and this wonderful flaming chariot that Elijah was, and then his cloak was like falling off of him in the back, and Elisha would be standing down the bottom. And I can just picture it just so clearly. And I think that that's interesting that the visual that I have for this isn't really what happened. And so we look into the text itself. I think you may have discovered some of the same things that I'm discovering. It's like, wait a minute, you mean he didn't go up in a chariot? I didn't realize that. I thought it was a chariot. So let's start at the beginning of this particular story and ask a couple of questions. One is that we recognize that Elijah and Elisha are very well connected. Elisha is not going to leave him alone at all. No matter where Elijah goes, Elisha is going with him. And the prophets that they run into tell Elisha, you know, that God is going to be taking Elijah. And he says, I know that that's happening. So the first question I have is, how is it that Elijah gets to bypass physical death? This isn't happening to him. Something else happens. Or does he physically die in the whirlwind? What is it about him that allowed this particular kind of end of life scene? When Elisha actually asks for what do I want from you, when Elijah asks him, what do you want? I would think that most people would say something like, if I could just be as half as blessed as you, I would be so thrilled. But instead, he asks for a double portion of what Elijah is given. So is that Elisha being greedy? Is he overstepping his bounds? And so I had a question about that, like, wow, usually a humbler person would say, if I could just have half as much as you, but he asked for double. And Elijah says, well, if you get to see me go, you'll get it. If you don't, you won't. And isn't that interesting? So Elijah already knew that he was going to be going soon in a special way. If you see it happen, you'll get it. Don't you love the imagery here of Elijah using his cloak to part the waters when they walk on dry land? And of course, where have we seen that before? There's something familiar about that theme. And then when Elijah is taken, it isn't in a chariot, it's in a whirlwind. Why? Why a whirlwind? Why not the chariot? Why was a chariot needed to part them? What's the significance of a chariot? And I thought it was really sort of interesting that he has parted this water into two places. They walk on dry ground, and then a chariot shows up. Wow, that sounds a lot like what happened as the Israelites left Egypt. Sort of lots of little connections there. And then, because Elisha does see Elijah leaving, he gets this wonderful blessing. But he is also pained. You can almost hear his voice as he sees Elijah leaving. You can feel his pain. My father, my father. How many people are we mentoring that are going to feel so badly when it's our turn to go, that they want to have what we can give them through the Lord? I think there's something to be said here for passing on the mantle. And of course, we know that this story is where part of that comes from, that passing on the mantle, that he got Elijah's cape. Notice that he too then used the cape to part the water, and that he was then able to bring fresh water to the people who needed it. And miracles happened immediately. He was able to do what God had called him to do. And then at the end, there's this little story about those boys that tease him and call him Baldy, and he prays against them. I think if I were telling this story to a group of children, it might be tempting to try to leave that part out. But at the same time, boy, doesn't this speak volumes about bullying and making fun and not respecting other people. And that look what happened when you don't pay attention to God's prophet. He prayed, and that wild animal came out and destroyed those boys. I would think that if I were to ask the children about that after I told them this story, I'd say, "What does this tell you about God?" That their answer might be something like this, as they have said to me before: "Wow, you don't mess around with what God says." Absolutely. But as you take a look at this story, what is it that God is saying to you in it? What does it tell you about who you are, about what you ask for from God? Who is your mentor? Who are you menteeing? And do you take your responsibility of obeying God and doing what He's called you to do seriously? And are you listening for God's voice? Have a great week.